A quiet boy slipped a $20 bill he'd found on the pavement into a soldier's hand, along with a small note, a simple act of kindness paying it forward. His mother worked long hours at a diner where every penny counted. Yet despite their struggles, he chose to pay it forward to someone who deserved it most, a soldier. Later that day, military Humvees pulled up, not for that $20 bill, but to honor something far greater. What they brought went far beyond the boy's gesture and revealed a truth the boy and his mother never knew was waiting. Welcome to Unraveled Whispers. We've got another heartfelt story for you, where a simple act of kindness opens the door to an unexpected truth. We hope you enjoy. Sarah slid a glass of cold water onto the table beside him, the ice still clicking against the sides. "You drank your milk an hour ago," she said softly. "Stay hydrated, okay?" Mike didn't look up. He was deep in his drawing, tongue tucked into the corner of his mouth, pencil moving back and forth like he was racing a deadline only he could see. Sarah stood there for a second, just watching him, the way his eyebrows scrunched together. She brushed a hand lightly through his hair and glanced at the clock. Still 2 hours until the lunch rush. This had been their rhythm for the past week. Ever since school let out for summer, Mike had been coming with her to the diner each day, her 11-year-old shadow tucked into the corner booth by the window. It had slowly become his second home, the seat cushions worn just right, the view of the parking lot familiar, his space, a small island of crayons, sketch pads, and half-finished drawings that curled at the corners from all the handling. But Sarah knew he was supposed to be somewhere else. He should have been at camp with other kids out in the sun, playing games, doing crafts, running wild like 11-year-olds are meant to. A few weeks ago, he'd come home from school with a flyer in his backpack, a simple, colorful printout advertising a local art camp. Just a week-long thing at the community center. Drawing, painting, even a field trip to the museum downtown. He was so excited when he told her about it. His whole face lit up. But later that night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the sign-up fee, then at the stack of envelopes beside the fridge. Electric, phone, gas, rent due in 10 days, groceries getting thin. She didn't even have to grab a calculator to know the answer. So the next morning, Mike didn't mention it again. He just packed up his sketchbook, climbed into the passenger seat, and quietly took his usual spot by the window, like he'd already decided the diner was going to be his camp instead. Sarah tried to soften it where she could, kept him close, slipped him extra napkins, fresh pencils, made sure the kitchen passed him a few extra fries during the slow hours. But still, she felt the weight of it, watching him sit there, day after day, while other kids had their summers. The bell over the door chimed as the manager walked in. Frank gave her a nod, heading straight for his usual spot behind the counter, where he handled receipts and kept an eye on the floor. Sarah's eyes flicked back to Mike. 2 days ago, he'd asked if they could get a new crayon set, just the cheap kind even. But that was the same night they'd run out of cereal, and she'd stood in front of the grocery shelf holding a calculator instead of a shopping basket. She wiped her hands on her apron slowly. 4 months now. That's how many times she'd taken her salary in advance. Not full pay, just enough to make the gaps hurt less. But still, asking again wasn't easy. Frank didn't mind. Not really. He was fair. But fairness didn't make it less awkward. On her way back behind the counter, she reached into her bag for a hair tie, and her fingers brushed the envelope she'd pulled from the mailbox that morning. Same printed seal, same return address. Another update with no real news. 14 months now. No decisions, no payments, just more waiting. She let out a quiet breath and tied her hair back without looking at it again. Later, during the lull before the lunch crowd, Sarah stepped behind the counter where Frank was sorting register slips, his coffee going cold beside him. She cleared her throat gently. "Hey, Frank, you got a second?" He looked up from the drawer, already reading it in her eyes. "Sarah, I wish I could," he said gently, "but I can't do any advances this month. Not for anyone." She hesitated. "I could pick up an extra shift. Double on Saturday even." "It's not about hours," Frank said, shaking his head. "Company policies tightened. Owners are watching the books." Jen asked yesterday too. Had to tell her the same thing. Sarah nodded, swallowing down the ask before it finished forming. Later, during the mid-morning lull, she wiped down the pie case beside Jen, her fellow server. The sun was climbing, cutting sharp lines across the counter. "You asked Frank yesterday?" she asked quietly. Jen smirked without looking up. "Yeah, got the usual, not this time speech." They worked in silence for a few beats. "He said owners tighten things." "Figures," Jen said. "Too many hands reaching early, I guess." Neither of them said more. Just two women in aprons, polishing glass and stretching the week a little thinner, each in her own quiet way. At the booth by the window, Mike had gone quiet too. His sketchbook lay open, the pencil resting between his fingers, unmoving. He glanced toward the counter where his mother stood, shoulders tight beneath her uniform, then back down at the half-drawn image on the page. A crooked booth, a napkin holder. Her. He shut the sketchbook. A few minutes later, with the bell above the door giving a soft jingle, Mike stepped outside. He didn't tell anyone, just needed to stretch his legs. He'd been sitting too long, and the light outside felt clearer than the thick air inside. He circled the side of the building slowly, the way he sometimes did after school. Nothing urgent, just walking. That's when he noticed the $20 bill lying near the far end of the parking lot, folded once, unmoving in the still air. He looked around. There was no one close by, no cars pulling out, no rush of footsteps retracing their path to look for lost cash. He waited a moment, then another. Watching the people nearby, an older couple talking near their car, a woman settling into the driver's seat, a teenager scrolling on his phone. No one checking their pockets, no one retracing steps, no one looking worried or searching. Still no one. He picked it up. As he stood there, fingers curled around the money, he heard the soft creak of the diner's front door again. A soldier stepped out, clean uniform, quiet presence. He adjusted the strap of his duffel, glancing around before walking toward the lot. Mike's eyes followed him, then down at the 50, and then the thought came, like a whisper from somewhere deep in memory. "Pay it forward," his dad's voice. Not the sound, but the words. Words his mother often repeated, about how his father, before he died in uniform, had started a quiet family habit. Once a month, give something to someone. No name, no expectation. Just give. It wasn't just a saying in their house. It was a promise, something they held on to after he was gone. After his dad died, Mike and his mom made sure the tradition lived on. Even when money was tight, they always found a way. Once a month, no matter what. Just like he wanted. Mike glanced back toward the diner. Then he turned, headed inside quickly, and grabbed a napkin from the counter. Finding a pen, he sat at a booth and began to write carefully on the folded bill. He stepped outside again, the note tucked neatly into the folded 50. The soldier had paused near the sidewalk, checking his phone. Mike walked up, quiet but sure, and held the folded bill out to him with both hands. "For you," Mike said. The soldier looked up, surprised. For a moment, he just stared at the boy's small hands, holding out a folded bill. "What's this?" he asked, brow slightly furrowed. Mike hesitated, then said softly, "I found it. Out there." He pointed toward the edge of the parking lot. "And my dad always said, if you find something that's not yours, pay it forward." The soldier studied him for a moment. "You sure about this?" Mike nodded once, steady. The soldier gently took the folded bill and napkin from his hands. He unfolded it, first the money, then the note carefully wrapped around it. His eyes moved slowly across the lines, reading every word. A quiet flicker passed across his face. He swallowed almost imperceptibly as he read. "This is something my dad started before he died while serving. He called it our family tradition. Pay it forward. When we find something that's not ours, we pass it on to someone. No names, no strings, just kindness. Mike Harper, son of Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper." He stood silent for a moment longer. Then softly, more to himself than to Mike, he asked, "Why me?" Mike looked up at him. "My dad was one of you," he said. "He would have picked someone like you." There was no long explanation, no speech, just a simple answer from an 11-year-old. But behind those words was something deeper. A boy who'd lost his father in uniform, who had learned not just to give, but to see, to recognize someone who might be carrying weight unseen. The soldier lowered the napkin slowly and looked back at Mike. His jaw moved slightly, like he was holding something in. He crouched down to the boy's level. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. "And wherever he is now, I think he's smiling." Mike just nodded. Small, quiet, but sure. The soldier looked at him a moment longer. He glanced down once more at the folded napkin in his hand, thumb brushing lightly over Mike's handwriting. "I didn't know your dad," he said after a beat, voice low and steady. "But I wish I had." He looked back at Mike, something sure in his eyes now. "I'll carry this with me, and I'll pay it forward too. That's a promise." No speech, no ceremony, just a quiet vow between a man in uniform and a boy with his father's heart. After a pause, the soldier's gaze shifted. "You out here on your own?" Mike shook his head and pointed toward the diner behind them. "My mom's in there. She works inside." The soldier followed the boy's gesture, nodding once like he understood more than he said. He stood tall again, steadying himself, then gave a small tilt of his head toward the door. "Well, let's go find your mom." And with that, the two of them, one in uniform, one in sneakers, walked together toward the diner, side by side. As the diner bell jingled, heads turned. Sarah was wiping down the counter when she saw Mike walk in, beside a man in uniform. She straightened instinctively. The soldier approached with a quiet steadiness. His gaze landed gently on her. "You must be Mike's mom," he said. "I am," she replied, brows lifting. "Is everything okay?" He gave a small smile. "More than okay. I just wanted to say thank you. You've raised a good kid. Brave. Kind. You should be proud." Sarah blinked, surprised. "Thank you. But what happened?" "Your son gave me $20, said he found it in the parking lot and wanted to pay it forward. Said it was something his dad used to say." Sarah's eyes darted to Mike. The soldier continued, "I don't know what made him do it, but it meant more than I can explain." At the far end of the counter, Jan paused mid-pour with a pot of coffee. Her head tilted slightly toward the conversation. And over at the register, Frank had stopped flipping slips. Now he was watching too, quiet, still, listening. Sarah gave a short, breathy laugh, the kind you let out when your heart doesn't know what else to do. "That's just something his dad believed in." The soldier gave a nod of deep respect. Then with quiet conviction he added, "Then he passed it on well. And I'll do the same. That's a promise." He gave Mike a quiet nod, then Sarah one more, then turned and walked back out into the heat. The bell jingled again as the door closed, and for a second the diner didn't move. No one spoke. It was the kind of silence that felt like a pause in judgment, the kind you don't hear, but feel. "Wow," Jan said finally, breaking the silence as she stepped forward slowly, a dish towel slung over her shoulder. "You're asking for an advance this morning? And your kid's out here handing $20 bills to strangers?" She let out a soft chuckle, but there wasn't much warmth in it. "Admirable, I guess, or just spectacularly bad timing?" Sarah didn't respond. Her hands folded over the rag she'd been using. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. She kept her eyes down, not because she was ashamed, but because explaining would have only made it worse. Frank had drifted back behind the register. He didn't say a word either, but his glance toward Sarah lingered a moment too long. It was the kind of look that didn't accuse, but didn't understand either. Then he bent over the drawer again. Jan walked off without waiting for a reply, heading toward the kitchen with a shake of her head, and the silence returned. Thicker now, heavier. Mike stood beside his mom looking up, not at her face, but just above it, like he was reading the shape of her silence, his sketch pad still clutched in one hand. Then Sarah finally looked down at him. She reached out, gently brushed the hair from his forehead, and gave a small smile, quiet, proud, but faintly sad around the edges. "You did good," she said softly. "Your dad would have been proud too." He nodded quiet and went back to his booth in the corner, the one by the window where he'd left his sketch pad. Sarah stood there a moment longer, eyes on him. Then she took a breath, turned back to her section, and got back to work. Outside, the bell jingled again. This time it wasn't a soldier, it was the lunch crowd. Within minutes, the diner stirred back to life. Orders flew, dishes clattered, and Sarah moved between tables with a practiced calm. But her thoughts kept drifting. Between coffee refills and sandwich plates, she kept seeing Mike's face. Serious, steady, holding out that $20 bill. He hadn't even mentioned the crayons he'd asked about 2 days ago. He could have spent it on that, but instead he followed his dad's words, their family's quiet tradition. She was proud, deeply, fiercely. But under the pride, something pulled at her chest. She wanted to send him to that summer camp, the one with art tents and bonfires, a place where he could run around, laugh with friends, be a kid, not spend 6 hours a day hunched over a sketch pad in the corner booth of a diner. But she hadn't gotten the advance, and rent came first, always. At the counter, she grabbed a fresh orange juice, popped a cherry on top, and brought it over to Mike's table. He was still drawing, though his lines had gotten slower. His shoulders drooped now, his hand barely moving. "You okay, bud?" she asked, setting the glass beside him. He nodded but didn't look up. She crouched beside him, brushing her hand over his back. "Only 30 more minutes, all right? Then we'll head home." He gave a small nod. "You want anything else? Toast? A milkshake?" He shook his head. Sarah gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, stood, and got back to her section. She didn't have time to linger, but as she cleared a table near the window, she glanced back at him again. Still sketching, still tired, still her boy. Outside, the diner had settled into a calm lull after the lunch rush. Only the occasional clink of glasses and soft footsteps filled the quiet space. Then the steady hum of the afternoon was broken by a low rumble, growing louder with each passing second. Gravel shifted outside the windows, drawing every head up. One by one, 4 military Humvees pulled into the parking lot. They weren't clean. They weren't polished. They looked like they came straight off a base, and they had. Frank stepped out from behind the counter, brows pulled tight. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. Jan dropped her order pad. The regulars in booth 3 turned their necks so fast you could hear a joint pop. Doors opened with hard metallic clicks. 15 soldiers stepped out in total. Not just guards or escorts, but men who looked like they had chosen to be here. Faces older than you'd expect. Faces that had seen things and remembered. A 5th door opened last. From the front Humvee, a man in decorated fatigues stepped down, silver stars on his collar. Gasps rippled through the diner. The bell above the door jingled. Everyone froze. The general walked in first. Behind him, 2 soldiers held a dark case and a thick envelope. They didn't scan for threats. They scanned for someone. Frank moved forward cautiously. "Is something wrong?" The general nodded once, calm but firm. "We're here for Mike Harper." Sarah's heart sank. "He's my son," she said, standing instinctively in front of him. "Is something wrong?" The general's expression softened. He held up a hand, reassuring. "No, ma'am. Nothing's wrong. In fact, we're here because of something very right." Mike blinked from the booth. Slowly, he raised his hand. The general looked right at him and began walking forward. "You gave something to a soldier this morning. A note and a gift." Mike nodded slowly. "Yeah, I found money, and my dad always said—" He trailed off, suddenly shy. The general nodded again. "You called it a family tradition, started by your father, Sergeant Daniel Harper." At that, Sarah's knees wobbled. Jen reached out to steady her. The general continued. "I knew Daniel Harper. He served under me in Afghanistan. He died saving 6 of our men, held his position during a chaotic ambush so others could get out. We made it home. He didn't." A quiet shift moved through the soldiers behind him. One of them, a man with graying hair and a silver wedding band, stood a little straighter. Another bowed his head for just a second, barely noticeable unless you were watching. Then the general glanced down, almost to himself. "The soldier you gave the note to, he brought it to me personally, said it stopped him in his tracks." He paused, eyes softer now. "I sat in my office and read it. Once, then again, and again. That little piece of paper said more than a whole wall of medals." He looked up, voice thicker now. "There's things we say to Gold Star families, things we're trained to say. But that note, that quiet act, it said more than all of them combined." He turned toward Sarah now. "Your husband saved lives. Your son reminded us why. And the truth is, we owe your family more than a thank you." He nodded once to a soldier who stepped forward with a dark case. Inside, Mike's note, his crumpled $20 bill. Both framed together, beneath the words, "This will hang in our division hall," the general said, "because it reminded all of us what Daniel stood for and what his family still carries." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But the general wasn't done. He nodded again. Another soldier stepped forward, one of the quiet ones who had barely looked up until now. He handed over a thick envelope with care, his expression unreadable, but his hands didn't tremble. "We looked into your records, ma'am. You were supposed to be receiving monthly survivor benefits, DIC and pension support, but due to a clerical error, they were never properly dispersed. 14 months now." Sarah blinked hard. I filed so many times. They just kept saying it was pending." The general's voice was firm but sympathetic. "It wasn't escalated properly. That's on our end." He handed her the envelope. Inside, a formal benefit reinstatement with back pay. Nearly $45,000, effective immediately. "The funds should reflect in your account by tomorrow morning," he added. Sarah stared down, speechless. The general continued, voice steady. "And beyond that, we've pooled a $25,000 hardship relief grant, privately raised by soldiers who served with Daniel. No red tape, just what's deserved." Behind him, one of the older soldiers gave the smallest of nods. Another pressed his lips together, fighting emotion. They didn't need to say anything. They had already given. The general stepped forward again. "And because of what your son did," he said to Sarah, "some of us who served with Daniel decided to do more. We reached out to a few foundations, veteran groups, and private donors. Together, we're launching something we're calling the Harper Honor Initiative, a privately funded program that offers help to kids of fallen soldiers. Scholarships, mental health support, emergency grants. Nothing official, just soldiers and civilians who care." He looked down at Mike. "And it all begins with your family, with Mike." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. The diner erupted into applause. Frank stepped back, visibly moved. Jan, speechless for once, looked between Sarah and Mike like she was seeing them for the first time. One of the regulars at the counter stood up and clapped. Then another. Then the whole room. A couple of the soldiers joined in. Not loud, not showy, but with quiet pride. One reached into his pocket, pulling out a small coin and rubbing its edge between his fingers. A habit, maybe. A memory. Sarah didn't cry from shock anymore. She cried from something deeper. Something that had been held inside for too long. Relief, yes, but also recognition. Mike didn't fully understand the scale of it yet, but he understood this much. He'd done what his father taught him, and the world had noticed. The general saluted the boy, crisp and solemn. Mike hesitated, then lifted his hand and returned it. Later that day, they stood at Daniel Harper's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the sun low on the horizon, casting a warm, fading glow across the grass. Sarah rested a hand on Mike's shoulder as he stood still, a small bundle of wildflowers clutched tightly in his hands. The stone marker was simple, name, rank, and years. But it carried the weight of an entire life, and the space left behind. Sarah hadn't visited in months, not because she forgot, but because it hurt too much. Now, standing there with Mike, it felt different. Not easier, but fuller, quieter, like something had come full circle. Mike knelt and placed the flowers gently at the base of the stone. Beside him, Sarah lowered herself with quiet grace, her hand steady on his back. Nothing needed to be said. The moment carried its own language. Grief, gratitude, pride. A short distance behind them, the general and a few soldiers waited, heads bowed, giving them space while remaining present. A silent tribute to the man they owed so much to. They weren't intrusive, just standing in quiet recognition. The next morning, Sarah stood in the diner doorway, apron still on, coffee pot in hand. Across the lot, the summer camp bus waited. Mike turned at the top step, his backpack bouncing, and waved. She waved back, smiling. He looked happy, really happy. The kind of joy she hadn't seen in a long time. They hadn't expected any of this. Not the visit, not the tribute, not the camp Mike had quietly given up on. But kindness had come back, quietly, unexpectedly, and just when they needed it most. Sarah stepped inside. The bell jingled behind her. Daniel was still with them, in Mike's heart, in every good choice, and now in the way the world had gently answered back. Sometimes it's the quietest moments that stay with us the longest. If this story touched you even a little, hit that subscribe button. We bring more true, heartfelt moments just like this, stories that stay with you long after they end. A quick like or share goes a long way in helping others find it too. And if you're still here, there's more waiting for you right on the screen. Stories we think you'll love just as much. Thanks for spending this moment with us. Until next time, take care, and goodbye for now.